So the session usually runs for 60 minutes overall, and that's usually 20 minutes per speaker with a question and answer session at the end. Now over to Anne.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. And I would like to welcome everybody this evening. And thank you very much for coming. As I always do, I'd like to start with a message of solidarity to our Palestinian friends who can't be here. And there are a great many of them. And also to our many Jewish peace activist friends who support Palestinian human rights. Just before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to put the evening into context, two contexts really. The first is COVID, and this pandemic is causing great suffering, as we know, across the world. And as we see on the news, it's taking a terrible toll among Palestinians. People are starving and not getting the needed treatment, with terrible outcomes from their families and their friends. And I just wanted to mention that because a very good friend of ours, Walid Hamad, who is typical of so many of the stories we hear. Walid, who did so much for children and young people in the Al-Amari refugee camp, became ill and then caught COVID a few months ago. He had no money for medication, and by the time he was taken to hospital, it was too late and he died there. And we're also very upset about that. But his family were left not only bereft, but with no money at all for their survival because he had been the breadwinner. The other point is, of course, that many families are being broken up as they're displaced through the Israeli demolition policies and going into overcrowded homes of relatives and so vulnerable to the virus. I mean, this year in East Jerusalem alone, 141 children have been left homeless through the demolitions. And many children, whether homeless or not, are living in great fear from soldier and settler violence as they do ordinary things like go to school. So they're having a really terrible time. But also many of the children are living in poverty. And this is especially a problem in the farming communities where income is being lost by the harsh restrictions on water, electricity and export put in place by the Israeli authorities. There's also the terrible stories we've just seen in the press of settlers stealing olives during harvest, which is going on now, and then burning and tearing down trees and flooding fields with sewage. And in addition, for so many of the children, they were in families where one member, in most families in fact, where one member has been jailed. So not only is that person unable to help with the income, but the families had to raise huge sums for fines and with devastating effects on them. And this has been Iyad's experience. Now, Iyad, who is one of the most remarkable people I know, he has led the non-violent resistance in Palestine from the village of Belin. And he is totally, utterly committed to that as a principle of living. He was going to speak tonight about his experience of the terrible wounding of two of his sons, very, very seriously wounded by the Israeli forces, and the imprisonment of a third son who, aged 17, was picked up in a pizzeria. Now, I don't know about you, but pizzerias have always, in this field, like for my kids, a safe place to go. But for him, it was not a safe place to go. And he was picked up and he was imprisoned at the age of 17. He was kept in for 13 months until a huge fine could be paid by the family. Now, on top of that, Iyad is having to spend his nights looking after his olives, and in the day he's harvesting them. And he isn't able to join us because he has a very, very bad chest infection. Now, I know Iyad very well, and I know that it must be very bad if he isn't able to join us. And of course, he's now vulnerable to COVID and all the problems that people are having. Iyad's very disappointed, and he's a great miss to us too. And he sends everyone tonight who's here his very warm best wishes and solidarity, and many thanks for taking the time to come and talk about the problem this evening. The second context I just wanted to put this in was that of international law. As we have a legal presentation tonight, I think this is a very important context. And a number of UN conventions apply to the children who we're talking about tonight that provide safeguards within international law and protect the child within the court and prison system. They are, of course, the 1984 Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel or Inhumane, Degrading Treatments or Punishment. And this one is so important because prohibition is absolute and unconditional. It has no exceptions. Not even security considerations or threats of war can be given as a reason for torture and cruel or inhumane degrading treatments. And the second one is the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is legally binding international agreement setting out the rights of every child, regardless of race, religion, or ability. Its four key principles that we all have to abide by are non-discrimination, devotion to the best interests of the child, the right to life, and survival and development. So enshrined in these conventions, a child, that is a person under the age of 18, who's prosecuted for alleged offences, must be treated in accordance with international juvenile justice standards, not adult ones, that provide them with special protection as a child. Arrest and detention must be in conformity with these conventions, including that detention is only used as a matter of last resort, and that children have access to parents and lawyers. Now, like us all, Israel is obliged to comply with these, both within its own state of Israel and the Palestinian territories that have been under its military rule since 1967. These conventions are enforced through monitoring by independent experts within UN committees, and for many years, credible reports have emerged of the violation of this convention by Israel from independent and highly respected experts. And tonight, I'm really glad that we will have our two speakers who will tell us exactly what is happening on the ground. So I'd now like to welcome, first of all, Gerard, and just to say a bit, Gerard, about you. Gerard is a lawyer and co-founder of Military Court Watch. He's focused on the issues of children detained by the Israeli military and prosecuted in military courts for the past 13 years. I think that's when I probably first met you. Prior to which he practiced as a barrister at the Sydney Bar, specialising in commercial and criminal cases. And then Gerard will be followed by Salwa, and I'll introduce Salwa separately. Gerard, you have 20 minutes, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It's very good to see some familiar faces. So I'll get straight to the point. Just very briefly, a little bit about Military Court Watch. It's an organization founded by 12 individuals, mainly lawyers, Palestinian, Israeli, European, American, and Australian lawyers. And we just focus on one issue, the military courts, and particularly prosecution of children in those courts. And one thing we do as an organization is we collect a lot of evidence. So each year, by the Israeli military. And we analyze this evidence for a number of issues. Were they arrested at night? Were they blindfolded, zip-tied? Do they allege physical abuse? Were there rights, legal rights under Israeli military law respected? But there's one particular feature of this evidence that stands out as significant, and that's what we would like to highlight tonight. And that is the location of arrest. Based on the evidence we've collected over the years, the overwhelming majority of children who are arrested in the West Bank, and by overwhelming majority, I mean, depending on the year, 96, 97, 98%, live and are arrested within, on average, 1 kilometer of an Israeli settlement or road used by settlers. And we would suggest that's not a coincidence, and we'll explain why we say that. Before I do that, I'll just very briefly put the military court system into a little bit of historical context. I won't take long, much of it you'll be familiar with. So Six-Day War obviously started on the 5th of June, 1967. It took Israeli forces less than 3 days to occupy the West Bank. And on the 7th of June, 67, they placed the whole of the West Bank under military rule and established military courts. And under international law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, Israel was completely within its rights to do that on the 7th of June, 1967. One of the provisos is it has to be temporary, but they were entitled to do what they did on the 7th of June, 1967. What I think is particularly relevant is the military order that established the military courts on the 7th of June, 1967, Military Order Number 3, expressly referenced the Fourth Geneva Convention as the legal basis upon which Israel was acting. So on the 7th of June, Israel itself was relying on the Fourth Geneva Convention to justify what it was doing. From a legal perspective, so far so good. What then happened between the 7th of June 1967 and about September 1967 is a political discussion took place inside Israel as to what to do with that territory. And those that wanted to keep it, settle it, and essentially annex it, dominated. And I think the best evidence for that is by September 1967, the first settlers started to move into the West Bank. Then you did obviously have a legal problem, because as you would all appreciate, whilst the Fourth Geneva Convention allows for temporary military occupation, military law, and military courts, it also prohibits settlement construction in occupied territory. So that posed a dilemma for the military lawyers who had just drafted Military Order Number 3 back in June 67, where they expressly relied on the Fourth Geneva Convention. So they had to overcome that problem. And the way they did that was quite simple. They passed an amendment to Military Order Number 3, and they simply deleted references to the Fourth Geneva Convention and carried on prosecuting Palestinians in military courts while the settlers continued to move into the West Bank. And obviously, since September 67, there has been a very real legal issue. Fast forward 53 years to today, I looked at some statistics today. There appear to be now around 700,000 Israeli civilians living in occupied territory. The breakdown is about 450,000 in the West Bank and 250,000 in East Jerusalem. And once the politicians in Israel decided that that was the thing to do, they then handed responsibility over to the Israeli army to make it work, to guarantee the protection of all those Israeli civilians living in occupied territory. And I should point out the 450,000 Israeli civilians who live in the West Bank are living among about 3 million Palestinians. I think if you stop and think about that for a moment, it's hard to imagine a more challenging mission you could give any army in the world than having to guarantee the protection of over 400,000 civilians wandering around a conflict zone. And yet that was the mission the Israeli military were given. Now, have they been successful? Well, there are any number of ways you could try to measure that. But if you look at data on fatalities, specifically the fatality rate for Israeli settlers in the West Bank, it's extraordinary. According to the US State Department in 2012, not a single settler was killed in the West Bank. Now, 2012 was an extraordinary year. If you go back the last 12 years, the average fatality rate for settlers in the West Bank is 4.9 settlers killed each year in the West Bank for the last 12 years. Now, not to trivialize those deaths when they occur, more people get killed in traffic accidents. It's an extraordinary military achievement. And the question that has raised, at least in our minds, is what are the tactics being employed by the military in the West Bank to achieve such a result? And that's where our work comes in, because we see these tactics on a day-to-day basis in the villages and refugee camps that we work in. And also the military courts are very much part of those tactics. And that's what I'll talk a little bit about now. Now, I think the best way to understand these tactics is to take a very typical kind of case. Imagine for a moment, a settler is driving along a fairly remote stretch of road in the West Bank, and suddenly stones are thrown at the vehicle. Potentially, that can be a dangerous situation. That incident will be reported to the local Israeli military commander. And the question is, what's he going to do about that? He knows from his experience that if he were to send a unit of soldiers to that location in the road to investigate, it's very unlikely anyone's going to be there. Few people are going to hang around and wait for the Israeli army to show up. It's very unlikely that he's going to catch anyone. So that poses a real dilemma for that military commander. He has an active resistance, whether it's dangerous or not. He knows it's Palestinians, but he can't positively identify who. So who is he going to arrest? Who will get prosecuted in the military courts for that act of resistance? Now, if that military commander were to do nothing and say to himself, well, I couldn't find anyone today, maybe I'll have better luck finding someone tomorrow to arrest, the chances are he's not going to remain in occupied territory for very long. It will send a clear message to the Palestinian population that you can resist, and there's a reasonable chance you can get away with that act of resistance. And that is not an option. But again, what is this military commander to do in that situation? Basically, what he does is he makes a couple of assumptions. These assumptions have nothing to do with the law, but from a military perspective, I think they're fairly reasonable. The first assumption he makes is that the stone throwers were Palestinian males aged between about 10 and 30, which will generally be the case. The second assumption is that they came from the nearest Palestinian village, and that too is probably going to be the case. What he will then do is he passes those two assumptions along to the Israeli intelligence officer responsible for that area. Now, since 1967, every area in the West Bank has had an Israeli intelligence officer. In many ways, that's not particularly surprising. If you're going to control territory, you will organize your affairs in such a way. What is perhaps slightly unusual in this situation is because it's gone on for 53 years, an enormous amount of intelligence has been built up on all of these Palestinian communities. Things like political affiliations, who has been arrested from that village before, particularly for stone throwing, if this is a stone throwing incident. But more importantly, who are the collaborators? Who are the Palestinian informants or collaborators in that village? Now, for understandable reasons, it's difficult to get hard data on this. But after 13 years, what I can tell you is that it's safe to say that Palestinian society has been thoroughly infiltrated with informants. And the impact of that is basically twofold. The first is that it means the intelligence officer will be receiving a lot of intelligence, some of it good, some of it average, some of it complete rubbish. The second aspect is more profound, and that is that these communities all know that they've been infiltrated. And that has a profound psychological impact on them. No one in these communities knows who they can trust. And in the 13 years I've been doing this work, this is the best explanation I've found for why you see very little coherent resistance in the West Bank, whether it's military, political, or peaceful, because it's very difficult to organize. To give you a sense of scale, and this is purely anecdotal, but in the villages and refugee camps that we work in up and down the West Bank, the issue of collaboration almost always comes up. And the types of percentages the people, the residents of these villages give us range from about 20% of the people in the village are collaborators up to about 60%. It's impossible to know where the accurate figure might be. But the point is that this is what the residents of these communities genuinely believe. And like I said, that has a profound impact on them. There are any number of ways people can be recruited. Frequently, the interrogation room is used to attempt to recruit people as informants. People can be threatened. You're going to go to prison for a long time if you don't cooperate. We will arrest other family members if you don't cooperate. We will cancel work permits if you don't cooperate. But also inducements can be offered, small cash inducements. Perhaps one of the most widely used methods of recruiting informants is the work permit system. So as you probably all appreciate, unemployment rates in the West Bank are pretty high. If you can get a work permit to work inside a settlement or inside Israel as a Palestinian, That's obviously quite a valuable commodity. But understandably, if Israel is going to give a Palestinian from the West Bank a work permit, they're going to put them through a security check. Assuming you pass that security check, typically you'll be given a 3-month work permit, which can be endlessly renewed every 3 months. What will generally happen is no attempt will be made to recruit that person when they first apply for the permit. The thinking being, if they're successful in getting the permit, they then go off and work inside Israel and they get used to the money. They start making plans for the future based on that income stream, on the expectation that that permit will be renewed. After 3 months, they go back to renew that work permit, and that's where the recruitment can take place. The person interviewing them frequently will say, we can renew your work permit, but we're going to need something in return, information. So as I said, we don't know what the exact figures are, but it's safe to say the society is thoroughly infiltrated. So what happens then is the intelligence officer will make contact with any informants in the village and put together a list of names of people who will be arrested for that incident. That information might be accurate, half accurate, complete rubbish. It doesn't really matter. The idea is to send a very clear and strong message to this village that resistance will not be tolerated. That list of names is then handed back to the military commander, and usually within about 48 hours of the incident, he will make those arrests. That's important so the village comprehends cause and effect. Someone in the village resisted, you'll get a visit from the military within 48 hours, and there'll be a price to pay. Most of the cases we document, a bit over half of the cases, the children are arrested in the middle of the night in night raids, generally between about 12 and 5 in the morning. There are a number of practical reasons why the military arrest people at night. First is very practical. Show up at 2 in the morning, the person is likely to be home. The second one is if you send units of the Israeli military into a Palestinian village during the day, chances are young men will come out and chuck rocks at it. Sometimes the military wants that. If you're familiar with the work of breaking the silence, they talk about making their presence felt and stirring up the population. If they don't want that though, they go in at 2 o'clock in the morning. The final reason the military goes in at 2 o'clock in the morning is probably the most important, and my colleague Salwa will talk a little bit more about this. And that is that if you send heavily armed soldiers into a civilian center of population at 2 o'clock in the morning, unsurprisingly, it has a tendency to terrify people. It's a very effective way of intimidating these communities into submission. If it is a night raid, then, like I said, typically it occurs around 2 o'clock. It will either begin with very aggressive banging at the front door. Sometimes the doors are blown off the hinges. Other times the military will gain access to the house quietly whilst everyone is still asleep. And the first they know about the raid is you have soldiers in your bedroom. Whichever technique is used, the family will be gathered into one room, usually the living room. IDs will be checked. The person they've come to arrest will be identified and taken away. In less than half of the cases we document, a bit of paper is given to the family about the arrest, but generally this paper is written in Hebrew and it says nothing about your legal rights. The most information that this document conveys is which interrogation center that child will be taken to. That's it. And in over half of the cases, no information whatsoever is provided. The person who's been arrested, whether it's a child or adult, will almost certainly then be blindfolded and zip tied, put in the back of a Jeep, sometimes on the floor, and driven off to an interrogation center. Most of these interrogation centers are located in the larger settlements, Ariel, Gush Etzion, Binyamin. They're not particularly far away, but it can take up to 5 or 10 hours to get there, largely because the soldiers in some cases will go off and make other arrests, or they'll stop at military bases throughout the West Bank where the detainees will be put in shipping containers, mostly left tied and blindfolded. So by the time you do arrive at one of these interrogation centers, it can be up to 10 hours. That person is likely to be sleep deprived. They may have been physically assaulted, not in every case, but in a number of cases. They will have been blindfolded and painfully zip tied throughout that period of time. The most significant feature of this system, though, is when the person does come to that interrogation room, they are psychologically depleted after that 5 or 10 hour journey, which means it makes it much easier for the interrogator to get a confession out of that person. So once the person is in the interrogation room, frequently they remain tied. They are blindfolded generally. The blindfold is removed, I mean. Now, the first interrogator the person sees will usually be wearing civilian clothes. They won't identify who they are. Now, under Israeli military law, obviously you have less rights under military law than civilian law, but you still do have some rights. Under Israeli military law, you have the right to consult with a lawyer prior to interrogation, subject to some exceptions, which generally do not apply to children. You also have the right to silence. In most cases, the overwhelming majority of cases, children are not informed of these legal rights. In the cases, it's about 20% now, I think, where children are able to consult with a lawyer prior to interrogation. It's typically a 1-minute telephone call placed on speakerphone with the interrogator listening. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, you're completely oblivious as to what your legal rights are. Now, what the interrogators generally do is, once someone is this depleted psychologically, it is not that difficult to get a confession out of them. Sometimes physical violence is used, but generally it's simply not necessary, particularly with children. It's enough if you intimidate, threaten, and yell at them. That will usually be sufficient. The sorts of threats are, you will go to prison for a long time if you don't confess. We will arrest your mother and sister if you don't confess. We will cancel your father's work permit if you don't confess. One technique the interrogators generally always use, and it's not unique to this, this jurisdiction, I'm sure you're familiar with it where you are to some extent, is the interrogator will say, listen, all of the other people we arrested with you, they've all confessed and they gave up your name. And because they confessed, we sent them all home. Now, when you're in a high pressure situation such as this, that provides quite often sufficient incentive for you to provide a confession. You give up a few names of your friends, might be accurate, might not be, in the belief that then you will go home. Turns out, in many cases, you're actually the first person to have provided a confession. And the interrogator will have recorded that on a tape. He then goes to the interrogation room next door where someone else is who was arrested with you from the same village. And he plays that tape of you confessing against that person. And then they confess on you and on everyone else. And he'll go from one interrogation room to the next, getting everyone to provide a confession against everyone else. And that's generally the main evidence in these cases, is confessional evidence obtained in the manner I just described. Within about 2 to 4 days, depending on your age, you're brought before one of 2 military courts in the West Bank, or I should say prior to COVID-19, you were brought to one of 2 military courts in the West Bank. It's generally in the military court, you'll see your lawyer for the first time. And whether you tell your lawyer you're innocent or guilty, ultimately your lawyer will probably advise you to plead guilty. And the reason for that is it's generally the quickest way out of this system. If you want to challenge the system, and technically there are plenty of ways you can challenge the system, you will almost certainly be denied bail, which means you're going to have to sit in prison waiting for the case to be heard by the judge. That can take up to 6 months. If you plead guilty, throwing stones, first offense, no one injured, you're looking at probably 3 to 4 months in prison. So it's simply quicker just to plead guilty. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, people will plead guilty whether they are or they're not. In addition to the custodial sentence, the parents of the child will also be fined in the order of about 3,000 to 4,000 shekels. As you would appreciate, that's a lot of money if you live in one of these refugee camps or villages in Area C. It's also very effective. If the military finds there's a village that is protesting, is resisting to a degree, they send the military in constantly, round people up, send them to the military courts, and essentially bankrupt people in the village. Based on a 2017 Freedom of Information application, in that year, the military courts raised nearly $6 million US. And that money generally comes from these communities in Area C, close to settlements. These are poor agricultural communities on the whole. But that is an effective way of also controlling these communities. the individual will also get a suspended sentence, typically averaging about another 4 months in prison, suspended sometimes up to 3 to 4 years. Then in the majority of cases, it's actually gone up. It used to be about 50% of cases involving children. The child would be transferred out of the West Bank to prisons inside Israel. That's a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, classified as a war crime. It's actually gone up to over 70% now. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, if you do have military courts and prisons, they have to be in occupied territory. They can't be some other place. Currently, there are sanctions on Russia for doing something similar in Crimea. Russia is transferring Ukrainians from Crimea to prisons inside the Russian Federation, and there are European and American sanctions on Russia partly for that. So after serving the sentence, the child will be released. This is a generalization, but on the whole, we find it to be a fairly effective system. Most people come out intimidated, traumatized. They never want to see another settler again. They never want to see the army again. They will avoid them wherever they can. If you're the military commander next door, you've basically achieved the mission you've been given by the politicians. You may not like the mission you've been given, but that's your mission. You've taken that generation of young people and you've made sure that the overwhelming majority of them will not in any way, shape or form resist the settlement project in occupied territory. I'll just wrap up now, and I'll just say one thing, a sort of general observation, and that is sometimes you hear Israeli officials say this, like, if you're not Palestinian and you're not Israeli, what's this to you? If it's just that you're concerned about humanitarian issues, there are a lot worse humanitarian situations in the world than this conflict in terms of number of people killed, et cetera, et cetera. So why is this issue of wider importance? Now, you may have any number of reasons why you believe it is. One reason, and certainly one reason that motivates myself, is the potential for this conflict and this situation to undermine and delegitimize the rule of law, to delegitimize the principles that were established at the end of the Second World War, in the hope that those principles might limit the prospects of us making the same mistakes again. And the problem is, if we don't apply these principles because Israel is a Western ally, now from a political perspective, that might be understandable. The danger is it, as I said, undermines and delegitimizes these principles. Principles that we might need ourselves in relation to, say, for example, Russia. Any number of Western politicians raise the rule of law when it comes to Russia's 2015 annexation of Crimea. Those words sound somewhat hollow when similar activities have been going on in the West Bank for 53 years. Similarly, when it comes to Western criticism of illegal Chinese activity in the South China Sea, again, those complaints can sound somewhat hollow when we don't abide by these principles ourselves. And I think that danger is only going to increase as this century proceeds, and as the challenges, particularly the multiple challenges that will cascade upon us as a result of climate change, we may actually need some of these principles. And if we can't make these principles work in the relatively good times, I think we're really going to struggle later on this century when the political and the security challenges that we'll face will be much greater. I went a little bit over time, so I'll hand over now to my colleague Salwa, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Gerard. Of course, there's so many things in there, but well done for keeping to time. It really does now give me huge pleasure to introduce Salwa. And Salwa is a Palestinian citizen. Both Gerard and Salwa are in Jerusalem at the moment. And Salwa, you actually, I think, co-founded Military Court Watch. So you've really seen the whole sort of development of the system as it's from that perspective. And I know it was your main interest is the monitoring of the treatment of the children. And prior to that, I know you've had a number of other human rights jobs within organisations that have and I know you through the women's movement. That's how I know you. on Palestinian economic and women's rights. So I just think if you could now just sort of pick up from where Gerard spoke, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the invitation. And as Anne mentioned, I will try to highlight some of the impact that this remarkably successful military strategy has on Palestinian children and the community at large. But before I do that, I would like to give a few numbers to give you an idea about the scale of what we're talking about, especially the extent to which military night raids are relied upon to achieve the objectives of the military. So each year, according to the military themselves, the Israeli army will arrest 1,400 Palestinians in the middle of the night. So that is a total of 1,400 night raids on Palestinian families each year. And this number is conservative because it does not include the many times when the military will go into Palestinian homes and not make any arrests. So those are not, nobody's keeping track of those types of night raids. So if you keep in mind the fact that most of these arrests take place in small towns and villages next door to settlements, and if you multiply by 53 years of occupation, that's a whole lot of night raids concentrated on small communities. So it's not a surprise when Palestinian parents tell me that each and every single house in their town or village was raided, if not once, multiple times. In their mind, it is not a question of if their house will be raided, it's a question of when. And they live their lives with this cloud basically hovering over their heads. To give you an example, one village near Ramallah, it's called Deir Nidam, near a settlement. And that village was raided 16 times in just 1 month. So every other night, the Israeli military were in that village, making their presence felt, waking everyone up, making all the parents wonder whether it was going to be their house or their neighbor's house or their relative's house. And as Gerard mentioned, this can have a profound effect on the psychology of these people and the decisions that they take. So these night raids, as you can imagine, are terrifying experiences, not only for the child that is being arrested, but for the family at large. Sometimes physical abuse is used. Sometimes the soldiers will cause damage to the furniture, the simple furniture that in the house. Sometimes they will be accompanied by trained service dogs who will, go into the house and scare everyone. One mother told me her teenage daughters woke up in the middle of the night when they had heavy breathing in the room. And it turned out that there were 3 soldiers in the bedroom together with 2 dogs. And on that occasion, the military opened the door quietly and they, entered the house without the family hearing. So let's say a child is arrested, he's taken away in the middle of the night, and maybe 4, 5, 6 months later, the child will be released. The family will celebrate the homecoming of the child. They will organize a party, invite family and friends, cook the best food, thinking the nightmare had ended. But almost as soon as the party is over, they realize that the nightmare had just begun, not only for the child, but for the entire family. Mothers tell me how the children's, the child's behavior is changed. He becomes, he isolates himself. He becomes more aggressive towards people around him. He rebels against the authority of his parents or maybe his teachers. He spends a lot of time by himself. He doesn't join the family, over dinner or lunch. Many of these children wake up all night and sleep during the day, which is a sign of depression. They don't want to face life, as we know it. The children who end up confessing to something they did not do because of the nature of how the interrogations are conducted, their world is turned upside down. Their understanding of the world is turned upside down. The red lines have been broken. They are being punished for something that they did not do, because the quickest way out of that system is to plead guilty, regardless of whether you're innocent or guilty. And we can imagine what this does to the child's ability to understand what's going around him. For him, the world becomes a scary place. It's not a predictable place to be in. It affects the way he relates to people around him in the future. And it basically has devastating effect on his psychology and on his mentality. Many children drop out of school after such an experience for a number of reasons. First of all, spending 4 to 6 months in prison, if you're in 10th, 9th, 11th grade, is a long time to be able to catch up with the schoolwork with hardly any meaningful education in prison. So children find it very difficult to keep up, and they prefer to drop out rather than remain in a lower class than their mates. Everyone else moves on, and they don't want to be stuck behind. So they drop out of school. Another reason why they don't want to go back to school is basically they are mistrustful of people around them, mistrustful of the children, of their colleagues around them, because they know one of the boys in their neighborhood or in their school gave their name to the authorities, and that is why they ended up in prison. So they don't want to be in that situation where they don't know who is going to report them, who is, will continue to give information about them. Even worse, they know that other children around them will be mistrustful of them because they spent time in prison. They were harshly interrogated. They probably gave somebody else's name or will continue to give somebody else's name. So it basically, this does the job of tearing apart the social network in the community, even at those children's level. And when a child leaves school, it's a future of failures and lack of opportunity and economic hardships. And even worse, many of these boys end up in the labor market because there's nothing to do. They don't go to school. So they go into the labor market. Sometimes they end up in jobs that are very harmful to them physically and socially. For example, some children end up working in bakeries. I know a few who tell me they have night shifts because a bakery works at night. So they sleep during the day and wake up all night with devastating physical and social effects that will last a long time. Other children find themselves working in stone quarries. I mean, the health hazards of those types of jobs is well known to everyone. So from this one experience of arrest and a night raid, the future of that child is basically predetermined for him and is very hard to rectify. The devastating effect is not seen or felt only on the children who get arrested, but also on the rest of the family. Younger siblings are terrified of this experience. They don't want to see any soldier again ever in their lives. One mother told me her son was arrested when he was 15, and she told me he's 40 years old now with his own children, and he still runs home when he sees soldiers on the street. It really basically does a job of terrifying and intimidating people. Younger siblings don't want to sleep in their beds anymore. They're scared. They want to sleep in their parents' bedroom. They are scared of being left alone in a room, even for a short period of time. Their school performance is negatively affected. Parents also suffer, of course, understandably, not only because they worry about the children, but mothers tell me how they find it very hard to sleep. Their sleep patterns are disrupted, especially the families who live near settlements. In their mind, it's a question of timing that their house will be raided. So many of them will take shifts. Somebody will sleep early at night, and then somebody else will wake up. One mother told me she sleeps by the window on the couch because she wants to be able to wake her family up before there's a big bang, bang at the front door. Another mother told me that she hardly sleeps at all, or if she sleeps, she sleeps for a few hours. Every sound outside wakes her up. They're hyper vigilant, and the effect of lack of sleep, we all have experienced it one way or another. The women wake up exhausted in the morning, unable to concentrate and focus. They are short-tempered. Their short-term memory is affected. They're incapable of making decisions, assessing a situation. It affects them physically. They become, they show symptoms of physical stress, headaches, stomach aches. Some of them have even more severe symptoms like high blood pressure, diabetes at a very young age. Many of them, to me, look 10 years actually older than they actually are. And I see this especially in younger women who even have not yet experienced a nightmare, because they know it's going to happen. They basically live the nightmare before it happens. Older mothers show the opposite symptoms. They basically find a way to switch off and become numb to the situation around them. And once you are numb, it's hard to switch on and off. These women find it hard to express an opinion, find it hard to express an emotion, find it hard to dream of a better life. They simply live on the margins of life as we know it. And this is what it takes to be living next door to a settlement. The child arrest, night raids, and these military strategies are a direct consequence of settlements, which are expanding even as we speak. Settlements are the epicenter of human rights violations, and they cause a lot of resentment and anger among Palestinian communities. And life for Palestinians will continue to be as it is as long as settlements continue to exist. I think I will stop here and allow for some time for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Salwa. It's just such a sort of vibrant picture that you've painted for us. So thank you very much indeed. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris for questions from people. And if you, as Chris said, if people would just like to say who they'd like to answer the question, whether it's Gerard or Salwa. But okay, Chris.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very, very much, Salwa and Gerard. I've got a couple of questions here. Katie, do you want to do the first one? I think it's from Ed.
Yeah, Ed has a question for both of you. Who he says thanks very much for the information, and he asks if the big wave of uprisings all over the world against oppression in the last few months, have they changed attitudes towards Palestinians, and is there more optimism that Palestinians can win their independence?
Salwa, would you like to go first, or?
Tough question.
It's a long, tough question. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I will give my personal opinion, and unfortunately, it's not an optimistic one. I think the current geopolitical changes, not only in the region, but in the world, is increasingly making the Palestine issue irrelevant. Unfortunately, the international norms and the legal systems that were put in place after the World War and tremendous suffering are being eroded, incrementally, and this is bad for Palestinians. And there's some kind of exhaustion, and no concrete steps forward are being taken for whatever reasons. And part of it has to do with Palestinian leadership, part of it has to do with interest, part of it has to do with the political dynamics. I mean, I'm not an expert on these issues, but I feel that this issue is being more and more marginalized. I don't know if Gerard has a different opinion.
Thank you very much. There's a lot in what you've just said to pick up on. Gerard, would you like to come in?
I think Salwa sort of largely covered it. I think that's right. I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, I think that is the danger of this conflict, that it does delegitimize many of these legal principles. And I think as the world changes, particularly, I think it's beginning to be discussed more, but personally, I think climate change is going to have a profound impact on this conflict. If you look at some of the statistics, some of the statistics are that there could be well over 1 billion climate refugees before the end of the century. Think of the political and security implications of that. Think what 1 million Syrian refugees did to European politics in 2015, and then imagine 1 billion or more. So I think, and that's my concern, that if it often doesn't seem like it when you're living through good times, but I feel we've been living through a golden age in many respects of peace and security. I mean, a lot of people haven't, obviously, but for a good many peoples for the last 75 years. And I think that may be coming to an end. And my concern is if we haven't been able to sufficiently make these legal principles work in the good times, then we're really going to struggle in the tough times ahead. And I think, time is running out.
I mean, if I may add one thing, I mean, if things look bleak at the moment, it doesn't mean that we should give up trying. I mean, Palestinian resilience is phenomenal, I think. People can take a lot and they will not give their rights up easily. The question is when that will happen, how it will happen, what is the trigger that will move it in the right direction. I mean, put some hope in a change in the American leadership. I don't know how optimistic that is, but if we have a different president, maybe things will move in a different direction. Maybe Palestinian elections will move things in the right direction. I personally am unable to predict, but it's not constructive to live, allow ourselves to live an illusion that things are okay, that things are, good, and at the same time keep the balance of not giving up or losing hope.
Yeah, on a more positive note, I think you never do know when change will occur. And I think, sometimes when it seems like it's at its bleakest, often change is around the corner. There's so many examples of that in history, whether it's the end of the Cold War or the situation in South Africa or Northern Ireland. Change often comes quite unexpectedly. And that's why, whilst I think it can be useful to look at the data and consider what could happen in the future, none of us can possibly know exactly what will happen, and we just have to do our best every day to keep that hope alive.
Can I just pick up on that question, because it is a very big question. It's obviously so many of the people in refugee camps are very young. I mean, I know in Al-Mari refugee camp, which is the one I really know, I think it's over half are under 22 years, so they have no knowledge of the past except their parents' experience living in these terrible situations. So it was really your thing about climate change. With the annexation proposal, huge number of refugees, where would they go? I think seems to me to be, and particularly as they're young. Have you any thoughts on that, Gerard?
My concern would be forcible transfer. The debate always is one state, two state, but there's a third option that is often not discussed, and that is transfer. It's a policy that was, worked in the past in 1948 to some extent. Now it's impossible politically to do that today, but in the kind of disruption that we might be facing in the second half of this century with climate change, if you have more than 1 billion people on the move, pushing 6 or 7 million people across a border is not going to make the headlines. And I think that is the risk, one of the risks with climate change, that I think that's more probable than suddenly all of these refugees being given some sort of rights inside Israel. I think that's quite improbable. I would love to be wrong, but
that feels to me very right. Sorry, Chris, I didn't mean to pick up on the question. There are other questions.
Okay, Steve says the way it came across, Gerard, it seems the only time that raids perhaps happen is when there's been a stone throwing incident. And is that the case? Did he pick that up correctly, or are there raids when there isn't an event like that?
Yeah, good question. There are other raids. There's some very interesting testimonies on Breaking the Silence's website from former Israeli soldiers. And they talk a lot about mapping communities. And basically what that is the young soldiers kind of led to believe that there's some really critical intelligence that needs to be gathered. And they have to go into this village in the middle of the night, break into any number of homes and line everyone up, check their IDs and take photographs of everyone, and also map the house, check every single room, photograph it, etc., etc. And then what some of the soldiers say is, they don't quite understand it, but they believe, it's an important intelligence gathering mission. And then what some of these soldiers said is, 2, 3, 4 weeks after the raid, no one had asked them for the photographs. There was no intelligence value at all, but they did serve a purpose. And that is the biggest strategy of many of these raids. And that is making the military's presence felt. And what that is the military's objective, particularly in these communities located close to settlements, is to have a constant military presence, whether there's been an act of resistance or not. And the idea there is to always put the Palestinian residents of that community on the back foot. That's all they can think about is, where is the military? Are they in the village? Can I go to the shops? Where are my kids? Will they get arrested? Now, if that's all you're thinking about, you don't have the headspace to come up with a counter strategy. And you can never win a conflict from a reactive position. And so that's part of the strategy, is to always keep Palestinians on the back foot and reactive, and not give them the space to be proactive and come up with any sort of coherent strategies. And so that plays a very important role. So yeah, good question. And these raids do occur when nothing has gone on. And sometimes the soldiers conducting them believe they're actually doing something useful from a military perspective. And it transpires that in many cases they're not. But it does serve a useful purpose, psychological purpose of intimidating that community.
Another type of raids, if I may add, is for training purposes. I have a concrete example of a mother who told me her front door was blown off with an explosive in the middle of the night while she was in bed. She woke up and looked in the dark bedroom, and there was a soldier in her bedroom. And then she found out that there were 7 other soldiers spread out all over the house, upstairs and downstairs. And within half an hour, they all left. They did not ask any questions. They did not search the house. They did not present any documents. They did not arrest anybody, nothing. Half an hour and they were gone. And the only reason she could think of is that they were conducting a training exercise on how to most efficiently and safely for the soldiers to conduct a military night raid, because it's used extensively, and it is very important that they, keep it up and do enough training so that they continue to conduct it. And many other purposes. I mean, these are just a few examples of military raids.
Yeah, and what Salwa was saying is confirmed by testimonies from Breaking the Silence, that they also conduct these raids as a training exercise. You have 19-year-old soldiers who have never blown open a front door. You need to train, but they train on real civilians.
But the effect is quite devastating. That mother told me she's scared of going home at night. You know, she's scared of being in her house in the evening. She wants to leave and run away. She said, my family is not involved in anything, nothing. We don't, you know, nothing. And yet we are not spared this terrifying experience.
Thank you so much. I'm keeping an eye on the time.
Can I just say to Steve about breaking the silence, if you want to put that on Steve, because it is such an interesting, and they've written a fantastic book, but it is worth reading because it does alternative view from soldiers who have come to a decision. Oh, brilliant! Thank you.
We'd also
Okay,
recommend,
so,
particularly the video testimonies. They have a lot of like 2-3 minute video testimonies about specific activities, which are quite compelling, some of them.
Well, that might just feed into an event that we may engage with some breaking the silence soldiers.
I just think we should just
Possible.
go for another couple of minutes. We are over time. Sorry about that. Very bad chairing. Very bad chairing.
It's okay.
Right, I'll go with Teresa's question. So Teresa says the situation looks bleak. So what role can us as supporters play for Palestine?
Okay. Salwa, do you want to just speak first and then Gerard?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a straightforward answer, but one way to begin is in your own countries. I mean, this issue is a symptom of how political systems in the West work. What your government does is somehow related to you individually, who you elect and on what basis, and how you continue or to engage with your elected officials, or maybe disengage, or maybe you elect them for your own internal purposes, which is perfectly legitimate. This is one thought that came to my mind. I'm sure there are others.
Okay. Gerard, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think picking up on that point, I think in the 13 years I've been here, in some ways, I think I've learned more about Western democracies than I have about Israel and Palestine, and how our policy is shaped, not just relating to this conflict. You know, whether it's interest groups to do with fossil fuels or tobacco or the arms trade or whatever it might be, and I think this system of governance, where policy can be dictated by interest groups, like the fossil fuel industry, potentially will lead us to disaster. And, I think we still have time to do something about it. But a lot of it is about, mobilizing in our own countries and trying to get a more reflective democracy. But it's, that's obviously very challenging, but that's one thought. Another thought, sort of on a more practical level, is it can be quite overwhelming, and I'm afraid some of tonight's talk has been a bit bleak. But on a more positive, the way we handle our work is, I think it's important to air some of these sort of wider, bigger issues and the conclusions, some of which are a bit bleak. But on a day-to-day basis, we are working on relatively small, but practical things can be done. And an example of that is access to lawyers, for example. This system is entirely dependent on getting confessional evidence out of people. If people have proper access to lawyers prior to interrogation, it's much harder to get that confessional evidence out of people. And so that's been a focus of ours. In the last, 6, 7, 8 years, we've probably taken about, 10 to 15% of the UK Parliament to the military courts, which means that there are a lot of parliamentarians who are familiar with this issue. And there have been a number of debates in the Parliament on this issue. And I know the Foreign Office does focus on access to lawyers. And I was just looking at our statistics from the evidence we collect. So in 2013, we recorded no child had access to a lawyer. Last year, or 2019, it was 34%. So it's gone from 0 to 34%. And that's largely due to interest in the UK. Now, there are a lot of 34%, that still means, nearly 70% are not having access to a lawyer. And the 34% who do have access to a lawyer, it's, as I mentioned, often a 60-second phone call with the interrogator listening. But it does show that you can generate pressure, which can generate movement in the right direction. Like, it is a marathon. It's, one step at a time. And sometimes that's all we can do, is just put one foot in front of the other and chip away. And that's how we try to keep our kind of morale up. Like I said, whilst it's interesting to consider the bigger issues, you can depress yourself quite quickly. And sometimes you need to have these small steps where you can show some level of progress.
Anne, could I just quickly ask this question?
Yeah.
Please. And I do apologise for
No, don't apologise.
We've got a newish leader of the Labour Party. He is a QC. And it occurs to me, have you got some advice for us to appeal to our new leader to make the statement that you've already made about the rule of law and how it's been undermined in the Palestinian military courts? I mean, that is a dead straightforward area, a subject area. I just wondered if you could help.
Absolutely. And also, we've got quite a head start, because in 2012, there was a report funded by the Foreign Office, prepared by a number of UK lawyers, including Stephen Sedley, Baroness Scotland, a number of leading QCs. And it was a very useful report, Children in Military Detention. It's on our website. I can send you the link. But after that, they were planning on doing updated reports, and the original delegation, not all of them were available to come. And Keir Starmer was one of the ones who was going to replace some of the lawyers who couldn't come.
Right.
So he's well familiar with this issue. At the last moment, the Foreign Office booked the tickets for the delegation, and about 2 or 3 days before the delegation was set to arrive, the Israeli authorities refused to meet with any of them. So it was cancelled. But so he is familiar with this issue. I can send you the link to the report, and it's something, that can be built on.
Yeah.
What we do in our annual report every year is we track, I think they made 40 recommendations, and we track the progress in implementing them. So in 8 years or so, one of the recommendations has been implemented.
Thank you. That's
As you said, Chris, you always end on a simple question.
Sorry.
We have run over time, but it has been absolutely amazing. I feel I've learned an awful lot, and really, really appreciate. And I think what you've shown us is that we do have to take effective action against the violations, and we have to do it in our own place. That's where we have to do it. But we also have to share each other. But the main thing is to have solidarity, I think, with Palestinians going through this. So I really do appreciate you coming, and appreciate everybody else who's come tonight. I just hope you got as much out of it as I have. Thank you both very much indeed. Okay, so speak to you soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.